So thank you to all 5 of you who showed up to my press conference to not yell at me. As we grow older, we experience more, and our opinions change based on those experiences. This is a universal constant, as concrete as death and taxes. But what's new is the internet and the way it preserves a record of the past. We're all, in a general sense, experiencing a modern phenomena where our past opinions are fossilized online and to be assumed to be our current opinion. But I feel like this is one that I do need to examine a bit further and set to rights, so consider this an of extremely late 2025 update to my opinions on a male character that's quite frankly very minor in the game he's in. I, once again, do not like Korekiyo Shinguuji. Do I get what they were going for with this character? Quite honestly, I have to answer this with a question of my own these days. Do you live within the confines of Kodaka's group? Because even though he is my favorite auteur and largely what inspired me to get into writing myself, I don't. I cannot tell you what he was thinking for Shinguuji, no more than you can tell me. Kodaka himself also couldn't tell us because Shinguuji was written almost 9 years ago by this point. Can you honestly tell me what you were thinking when writing your own OCs nearly 9 years ago? Every detail perfectly preserved and untainted by the ways you have grown. I sure couldn't. There's an entire media discourse to get into about death of the author that we don't have time for, but I assume what you actually want is the answer to the question of, do you agree with me that Shinguuji was a victim of abuse, or am I going to have to guilt trip you for thinking otherwise? And I think the question I just put in the viewer's mouth pushes forth how I feel. I personally assert that the reading of Shinguuji as the victim of abuse has a lot of flimsy evidence supporting it. Fanon depiction insists that his sister was specifically significantly older, but the actual text only mentions she was older, and no time specificities are given to how much older. Some of the things that Shinguuji says anecdotally are a little off, but not explicitly indications of abuse. Other characters get significantly more concrete implications of abuse from positions where they have even fewer resources to assert that this is what's happening to them. Furthermore, his sister is dead by the time the game begins, in the story writing department. This leads to my first major point, that Shinguuji is the only point of reference we have to characterize his sister, and one of the whole things about Danganronpa V3 is that it's full of unreliable narrators. It literally starts with you playing as one. I don't think we can definitively call him a for sure victim of abuse by his sister. Another equally valid reading is that he was not abused by her at all, and his study of cultures where incest wasn't a taboo led him to also no longer see it as a taboo and turn her encouragement of his study of anthropology around on her to abuse her. It's not a reading I agree with, but it is a valid reading. The fact that quite a few Shinguuji fans are content to divorce him from his behavior and actions through pinning them all on the nameless, terminally ill, dead older sister is certainly something you can read into. I sure have, given the amount of fans of his that I've met that aren't misogynists in one way. I can count that on a single There's one Shinguuji fan that I've met that isn't a misogynist. To be clear about where my own reading stands, I don't think either sibling abused the other. I think their relationship was unhealthy. I think his grief when she died affected him deeply enough to cause severe psychological distress that manifested in horrendous ways. But I don't think that it was an abusive relationship. To be clear, the video title is clickbait to get people to check out the video, a parody of the previous video I made about him. I'm not actually asserting that this reading is the objectively correct one. With all that said, I feel like this is the reading that takes into account all of the evidence. And honestly, given what we've seen of Daimon, Shingetsu, and Kamuri in Ultra Despair Girls, and of Ima Tsukumo in 100 Line, both of which were written either side of V3's release, I think it's safe to say that if Shinguuji was intended as a victim of abuse, the writing would be a lot clearer about it. I'm not saying subtle depictions of abuse victims don't exist, but I am saying that Kodaka doesn't tend to be subtle with that. This isn't even mentioning the elephant in the room, regardless of what reading you decided to take into for him, that Shinguuji still murdered over 90 women. He murdered all of those women explicitly for his dead sister. He says himself it was his own idea to give her friends in the afterlife. Whatever his reasonings, he still murdered a whole bunch of women, fully of his own volition and free will. I'm not some prude who thinks a character can't do evil things or be evil and still be enjoyable, contrary to popular belief. I love a good villain. I really enjoyed Saravok and John Irenicus from the first two Baldur's Gate games, and I really enjoyed both of the characters that could be described as the main villains of Hundredline. But these games make it pretty clear that, even though they might be in some regards victims of their circumstances that force them into difficult circumstances to some extent, they still had and made a choice to do what they did. The writing reflects this. Even the writing of Danganronpa V3 itself reflects that Shinguuji is in fact still a horrible person. Even under the reading of him as a victim of his sister's abuse, he perpetrates and worsens that cycle. But weirdly enough, he's treated almost like a tragic heroic figure by his fans, which is especially weird to me, given the other four murderers all had far more sympathetic motives. Shinguuji has the only explicitly and solely selfish motivation in Danganronpa V3. I've noticed that as a pattern with Danganronpa fans. With female killers, antagonists, and villains, you're expected to just accept that they're evil, whether that's entirely true or not. Even if, as is the case with Tsuniki, they aren't necessarily a villain, but legitimately are the tragic little meow meow of circumstance, splintering under a situation she can't control, such as literal brainwashing. But with male characters, regardless of what it is, you're allowed to just make up as much nonsense as possible, with tangential attachments to the text at best, to justify them purely as a tragic figure or circumstance. This extends well beyond Danganronpa as a whole. Danganronpa is just a much more noticeable instance, since there's about an equal gender distribution between the binary genders. Female villains need to sit and stew with what they've done, no matter what their circumstances are. Male villains will have those actions excused no matter how heinous they are. Female characters are irredeemable villains, but male characters are temporarily embarrassed heroes. I talk about the topic of gender in fandom regarding characters because gender is intrinsic to the explicit violence that Shinguuji represents, inflicts, and exemplifies. You can't, he's just a girl to me, hehe, heart emoji, sparkle emoji, him out of being written as a violent misogynist. When he finally confesses to the murders of Yonaga and Chabashira, he explicitly says that aside from Harukawa and Iruma, he would have killed any of the women present, and only the women. Aside from the obvious of him explicitly saying he targets women alone for murder, it strongly implies he sees something wrong with Harukawa and Iruma. Something wrong with how they perform their female gender roles. Iruma is openly and confidently promiscuous, shockingly intelligent, and refers to herself as Ore-sama in the Japanese version, a masculine and self-aggrandizing pronoun. And Harukawa was already described as too masculine by Momota earlier in the chapter, with him saying that women shouldn't know how to do what Harukawa can do. It all implies Shinguuji sees those two as threats to his sister's femininity and purity as a woman, as threats to womanhood as a concept. It's not actually a slay queen feminist win for him to say he won't murder the two who don't fit his ideal of a woman, because it's clear he views them as worse than the other women because of it. This is why a lot of Shinguuji apologists wind up being misogynists. I'm not talking about his normal fans here, to be clear. I'm explicitly talking about the apologists. To downplay and or excuse his actions, you have to downplay and or excuse the inherent and explicit misogyny of his character. You have to insist that Shinguuji is a character with no agency, as he goes through the murders of nearly 100 women and tells you that's what he did of his own free will. You have to ignore his own words, and insist the misogyny he inflicts is not his own decision, but is actually the decision of a female character who was disabled, terminally ill, and died before the story even began. This isn't saying you can't like a character who's a misogynist, or even that you can't like Shinguuji yourself. I like the characters of both Chucky from the Child's Play franchise and Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, both of which are also misogynistic murderers. Patrick Bateman's misogyny is one of the major themes of both the book and the film. But I don't deny that fact and say, well, actually, the women were the ones who were really responsible for all the horrible things that Charles and Patrick did. Like, Tiffany Valentine and Charles Lee Ray are both capable of their own sick, depraved shit individually, and I love them both for it. I think it's good to have bad people exist in stories like Danganronpa, as without them, the entire plot has to really work to contrive reasons for these people to kill each other. But I question the wisdom in creating excuses for those characters' actions to be justified, especially when we're selective about who we do it to, And especially when that selectivism is used to excuse male characters of misogyny. The problem isn't fans who own up to Shinguuji's actions. It's with those who absolve him of them and ignore the writing's reasons why he isn't meant to be absolved. I mentioned earlier that female villains are villains while male villains are temporarily embarrassed heroes. And I don't think there's a bigger example of the disparity between male and female characters that do horrible things than Shinguuji and his victim, Yonaga. Yonaga is implied to have actually been traumatized by the things she's had to do for her island community in being elevated to a living idol and mouthpiece for their deity, having to sacrifice a lot of her own wants and needs in favor of what everyone else insists their god wants of her. This becomes very evident in her second free time event with Akamatsu. Simultaneously, this position grants Yonaga a lot of power, which, as we saw with the formation of the student council and additionally in her Love Hotel event, she has no problems abusing herself. She's not really as explicitly villainous as Shinguuji, but she certainly gets treated like she is. But she's a complicated character who can't really be slotted into heroic or villainous. I'm unable to help but notice that Yonaga is visibly a Pacific Islander girl, while Shinguuji is one of the palest characters in the game and a man. Again, female or brown characters are held fully accountable for their wrongdoings, even if held to it a little too much, while male and pale characters often get it excused or reasoned out. And this is stupid. Why should a character's gender or skin tone determine the specific kind of discourse they receive regarding their actions?
But Nix, what about Chabashira, who is pale and explicitly a misandrist? The text even says she is.
Well, Chabashira is not a violent murderer for one. She doesn't go around marking men as worthy or unworthy of being Neo-Aikido tossed off a cliff into rocks depending on how well they perform male gender roles. For two, her misandry is often played as a joke or a punchline that's more often than not at her own expense rather than at the expense of the men around her. For three, her free time events make it pretty clear that her Aikido sensei was the one who instilled this belief into her. Said sensei as a man, refer to for two. For four, her writer is also a man. I would safely say that draws a pretty steep line between the misandry that Chabashira displays and the misogyny that Shinguuji displays. But you're free to tell me how a few mean words about men and tossing people around a bit is comparable to being what would be the 5th worst serial killer in history recorded with exclusively female victims. I won't listen for obvious reasons, but you're free to do it. But quite frankly, at the end of all of this, will I ever give Shinguuji another chance to impress me with more nuanced depictions of his character? Point blank, no, I won't. Danganronpa V3's story is done, and by this point, I'm admittedly a little tired of it in general. Perhaps, though, the biggest nail in Shinguuji's coffin is there's a character who takes all of the traits that I actually do like about him, and replaces a lot of the misogyny and incest inklings with something that's far more interesting philosophies on death, killing, and turning such acts intimate, and the drive to murder and kill as an act of love. It's Yugami Omokage from Underline. Omokage is pretty much everything I liked about Shinguuji, but without the severe misogyny that puts me off him. There are certainly moments where he says a lot of fucked up shit, does a lot of fucked up shit, but quite frankly, it's a lot easier to swallow when the reasoning is he's just kind of like that, than the woman he's speaking to isn't feminine enough to be murdered by him. Omokage is also in a game that can far more easily explore all of these aspects of his character, whereas Shinguuji is very limited by the structure of E3. So, if there is a character that is everything I liked about a character I didn't like, while also containing none of those traits I didn't like, I'm sure that the conclusion of, I don't really feel like I need to go back to the character I don't like is at least an understandable one. I get that some people will be upset about this assessment, insist I need to actually give him another chance, or me deciding that my mind is made up right now forever is illegal or something, and quite frankly, I can't imagine myself living a life where my opinion on my favorite characters is that fragile. Like, do you really need me to yay or nay your favorite characters? Do you need me to sign off on the moral warrant of, am I allowed to like this character? Yes, you are, obviously, I'm not your father. I like Omokage a lot more than Shinguuji. That is okay for me to do. It is fine if you like Shinguuji more than Omokage. I don't get that, I likely never will get it, but that is fine. We're all slapping around imaginary people at the end of the day. This whole thing, as I've said multiple times, isn't a condemnation of Shinguuji's character and saying no one should ever like him again. I'm merely pointing out an aspect of it that I think people have done a disservice by ignoring and misrepresenting. I do think that this is something that fans need to sit with and consider. And don't worry, this will likely not be the last time I talk about misogyny and fandoms in this channel, because I got a bigger target than Canon Danganronpa in my sights for a similar video.